A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And so, it's fair to say that after I talked about Sharknado, I might as well get to the sequels. So, what are we going to do here? Obviously, we're going to go with the second film, Sharknado 2, the second one. Because, for the most part, compared to the first film, I feel like this one probably could actually be even better than what the first film had to offer. Because first of all, instead of it being in California, it's on the direct opposite side of the state in New York City. And in comparison to what the first film had, the second one not only opens on an impressively nail-biting experience aboard an airplane, but it also gives us a unique sense of where Mr. Shepard himself is truly from. Finn actually is from New York and not California. For the most part, why he's there is because he actually had that bar, which was unfortunately destroyed, so now he basically no longer has a home there. And on top of all that, April Wexler's home in Beverly Hills is also pretty much a goner, thanks to that first storm. So we basically have ourselves a story that's set in New York, the direct opposite of what the first film gave us, which was in Southern California. And for the most part, I will have to say that when we open on this entire experience, it almost gives us a similar experience as to what happened in the Twilight Zone, where the Ian Ziering character himself actually is the one that freaks out and supposedly sees things outside the plane. And, well, even the air marshal taught him that he needs to calm himself down. And so, when it starts to become apparent, though, that the storms are actually coming back, this time on a certain other part of the world, well, it not only opens up an impressively horrifying note for the likes of Finn Shepard and April Wexler, but for everybody on board. Even the two crew members that are in the cockpit of the plane, Flight 209, which I can't help but wonder, was the term Flight 209 ripped off of Family Guy? I feel like it is, since Flight 209 was also a thing in Family Guy from one particular episode that came out years before this film. Anyways, though, it's up to Ian Ziering himself, Finn Shepard, to save the day. He basically gets into the cockpit, warns the nearby air traffic control center of the nearby airport that he is about to make a crash landing. With both pilots dead and with him at the controls, he is successfully able to land that plane. And as for April Wexler, she almost gets flung out the side of the window and even has to defend herself against an incoming shark, which ends up taking her hand off. Yep, straight up amputation. Who would have thought that goriness of that level would just emerge right from the get-go? But well, of course, after everything that happened in the first film, the loss of Boz and George and other members they've known about pretty well, and then of course, with all that had happened between the likes of the son of Finn as well as Nova, it really makes us wonder, could there possibly be any more details out there relating to the cast? Well, eventually, in the state of New York itself, as the disaster of Flight 209 is shown off, and that some people are dismissing it as a series of either hallucinations or fake coincidences. After all, this was before fake news became a popular term. But it still was a thing, as people could still create fabrications amongst many different things. And while these days it can be well limited depending on how you look at it, or how anyone else looks at it, back then, it just didn't seem that easy to work with. Lots of people could get away with many different things, like cyberbullying. But let's be real, we're living in simpler times now. We know what people can do on the web, and we're ready to take action whenever possible. Anyways though, in New York, we're basically introduced to even more characters. We have more members of the family and more friends out there that we practically have to start worrying about. We have the likes of Mark McGrath and Dante Palminteri as the likes of Martin and Vaughn, whom are well known in the state of New York. You also had the likes of Vivica A. Fox, known in her character Sky, whom basically had known Finn since his days in high school, and at one point even does kiss him, knowing she apparently had a crush on him this whole time. Too bad he was already married, but then again he was divorced, so I feel like that could have worked out in its own unique way. And then we got other characters out there. Judd Hirsch plays the bravest taxi driver of all time, known as Ben. At least the bravest since we saw Robert De Niro from Taxi Driver. Maybe I'll talk about that film sometime. And then of course we have ourselves a variety of other New York based people out there. We have ourselves Al Roker, Biz Markie, and even various other celebrities that have come around in the state of New York and even elsewhere. So what do we have to say about other things relating to this film? Well, we know the plot line, of course. It does start with that horrific airplane crash, but as we get further into the film, Finn and April head to the hospital. Her arm, of course, was amputated after being bitten off by that shark, so she basically just has to sit in there for some time. She has to sit in there for a while. And all Finn can do pretty much is just meet up with other people that he knows, including the likes of Martin and Vaughn, as well as some more friends whom are big fans of the New York Mets. After all, a game was basically taking place at around that same time that they got to the hospital. And when Finn does go out there, that's where he encounters taxi driver Ben, and believe it or not, Ben actually does know him pretty well, especially since the events of the first Sharknado film had transpired. Basically speaking, he's a fan of his work. A big fan of him pretty much being a hero. And we know that even the likes of April Wexler had created a book specifically about the events of the Sharknado itself. And this was definitely some news that made a lot of people turn their eyes towards the likes of Finn, April, and others. After what had happened in California, who would have thought that New York would become the next target for such a big disaster like this? Anyways though, even when Finn does make it to the Mets Stadium and meets up with all the people he knows well enough then and there, Martin, Vaughn, Sky, and even others themselves, and even after a certain baseball player that was well known in the New York Mets roster was also present at that game, well, disaster unfolds once again. Because the Sharknado starts to emerge into the field, and even when they try to prep things up for a supposed delay, the game unfortunately becomes terminated midway. So of course, they now have to evacuate the field. Because the storm brews so bad, sharks start piling up from above, and when that happens, people start to get munched on. Everybody makes their way out of the stadium in order to head to the nearby train stations in the hope that the railroad can help them escape and bring them further into the city to prevent any more casualties. But it only goes along so well. Meanwhile, there's other members of Finn's family and friends that he also has to keep a lookout for. 3 girls are basically out there, along with another member of his family. And wouldn't you know that they're basically out there on the Liberty Island ferry on their way to the statue of Lady Liberty herself when the storm breaks out at around the same time as it does when it enters the Mets field. And so they have to evacuate, much like the others did. When they get back onto the ferry though, it unfortunately is only a bittersweet victory, because one of the group members unfortunately gets chomped to death. And the other 3, while they do barely make it out alive, there's a whole series of events that, much like what Finn and company have to deal with, these girls have to deal with as well. But we basically cut back and forth between these different groups. And eventually, April wakes up from her slumber. And she attempts to make her way out of the hospital building, even helping a little girl find her way back to her mother. And so, once she does make it out of there, even after being told to go down into the emergency bunker, where everybody else was supposed to go, including all the patients, well, That's basically what happens. She basically escapes the mall itself and the hospital itself to attempt to find Finn and the others. While everything else is transpiring, the trains, the ferries, the garbage truck with the floating Lady Liberty head itself, much like what happened in Cloverfield. Oh boy, that itself was a doozy. But even here, it seemed to be a little more than a shameless ripoff. After all these events go together, everybody eventually reunites with each other, with the likes of April, Finn, Sky, Vaughn, and everybody else, with the exception of a few members. Even taxi driver Ben doesn't make it, as the flood emerges and a supposed game of Tarzan turns into shark bait, as Ben is eaten up. Leapfrog was their only way out. And when they make it out of there, even with supplies and gas and water guns and all sorts of different things that they had to do, because after all, there were no gun stores or chainsaws available in the state of New York. Yep. They had no real way of defending themselves from the sharks, with the exception of materials that they were able to thankfully gather from most local outlets, including a pizza joint, where we come across Vinny, played by Biz Markie. Yeah, who would have thought? Such a unique guest star right there. But when it all comes down to, the city basically heralds Finn as the true Sharknado hero, as he wields a chainsaw provided to him by the local fire department. And even the mayor cheers him on, knowing that he is a New Yorker and his city is behind him. Sharks start coming around, but Finn shows his courage to defeat the Sharknado once and for all. He makes it up to the top of the nearby tower, where he's prepared to launch some bombs. And well, when that doesn't work out, they have another plan. They're going to use a tower loaded with Freon tanks. Yep, if they can't burn the tornado down, they might as well freeze it. After all, any changes in temperature, extreme as they may be, can cause a tornado to dissipate mid-air. So that's what they do, with the likes of Finn and Sky making their way up to the top floor, arming the Freon tanks, with the wiring unfortunately not quite reaching in that well. And when it does, Sky has to hold them in place, while Finn uses a chainsaw to complete the electrification circuit, causing the tanks to explode. He and Sky get launched into the air as the tornado begins to dissipate. Finn once again braves himself for another swallowing of another shark, but he goes right through it this time, as opposed to just simply chainsawing through the gut of one and pulling himself out. Yeah, it certainly has gotten a lot easier as time goes on. And while Sky doesn't make it, unfortunately, Finn and April were able to defend themselves from the rest of the sharks. And when Finn finds his way back down after the shark impales itself on the top of the nearby tower, and when another shark comes in, believe it or not, with the same hand that not only had the gun in it from Flight 209 in the beginning of the film, but also had the old wedding ring. Yeah. Finn fires shots at the last sharks with that same gun, and also removes the ring from that hand, proposes to April for another marriage, to attempt to try things all over again. She agrees to the whole thing, accepts the proposal, and now we truly have the ending to a big chapter in this series. Two divorcees now reunited and remarried. Who would have thought it actually would turn out to be an even happier ending than what we had in the first film? Out of all the films in the series, I'd say this one does the absolute best. It's quite uncommon that sequels could actually do even better than what the original could pretty much do. But as some series would put it, it can be done, provided you know what to do. We know Pixar was able to do very well with creating a third Toy Story, and even the fourth Toy Story film was an astounding masterpiece in its own unique way. So Sharknado 2, by all means, gets a good 9.0 out of 10.1 as my overall scoring on Sharknado 2. So, 4 more films to go. We're only a third of the way there, but I'd say we sure do have lots of business to tackle. So from here on out, consider the Sharknado film series to be one worth booting. I'll see you guys tomorrow with the third film, and as always, take care. There's a storm that may be rolling in right about now.
Whatever I want, I usually get. And I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.